We've been looking through 1 Corinthians 7 and noting its relationship to the rest of the book. And that is, it begins the second major section. The first section dealt with two big problems that they maybe didn't appreciate that they had, but Paul knew they had based upon the report from the household of Chloe. And that was they had a problem of division within. That was covered in the first 4 chapters. And then there was a problem of immorality within, which is covered in chapters 5 and 6 and addressed with church discipline. It was an issue of fornication, and that was addressed and then explained why that is so wrong. He then transitioned, beginning in chapter 7, in a very natural transition from fornication into the question of marriage generally, so as to make sure that there was not a misunderstanding in teaching against fornication, that meant a complete, in some way, elimination of sexual activity, but rather that there was a proper place for that, and that was marriage. So what you find as you come into chapter 7 is he begins answering all these questions specifically about marriage, and we see that in series. And the first thing was, as he brought this up, and it was addressing the questions they have. You see that in verse 1. And we looked through what he was basically doing is he is addressing that first question. He doesn't want them to get the wrong ideas. This idea of quoting and then going on, it's not good for a man to touch a woman. Well, generally speaking, sexually, that's right. But that does not mean it's entirely wrong, because it's right within the context of marriage, which he then works through in that early portion. And then, having established that, he comes to another situation in verse 9. Or 8 and 9. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, okay, so we've got a different situation that it is good for you to remain as you are. Now, he's going to come back to the reasons why. He is definitely not saying, hey, look, if you're married, you can't help it, sorry. That's not what he's saying here. But he is also saying that right now it's good for you not to marry in this current situation. And again, we'll come to and see that more a little bit later. But then, as he picks up in verse 10, now he gets to the married specifically. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. And we discussed that. Now we're discussing marriage. He establishes that, going back really as an allusion to Matthew 19, that the Lord has spoken on this, and that is, basic rule, don't get divorced. Okay? Don't do that. But then, as you look at verse 12, he recognizes there's a situation in which some might already be in that situation and need instructions as to how to handle it. And the instruction was twofold. That is, first of all, you remain unmarried, and then you seek reconciliation. That was the answer to the general problem of you are divorced. It's my first message about don't divorce didn't get there in time, so you're in this situation. You came to Christ in that situation. All right, here's what you do. Right. And the other discussion we had about this was, as he's told them that that's not a good enough reason, okay, is found in what follows when he then picks up and is addressing the situation with, well, what if my spouse is not a Christian? What do I do now? And as we had that discussion, the point was, it says the same rules apply. If your spouse isn't a Christian, if they're content in the situation in marriage, good, you stay married. But then he comes to the other situation, and that does come up, and that's in verse 15, that if you have an unbelieving spouse and they choose to leave. Now notice, and we pointed this out, it was their choice that they left. And the point is they left because you are a Christian. And they don't want to stay with you living that kind of way, or even you living that kind of way. And they're not gonna accept that. And then it says you're not bound in those cases. We'll come back to that in just a second. God has called us to peace. But then he, from verse 16, says something very important as far as when you're looking at this overall. So we make sure that he's closing off, and yet not quite this section. Because he says, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? And he is explaining why they should stay together. Why you do not. Why? Because this person that you claim to love, they're lost, and your idea is that the best thing for you to do is to shove them out the door? You ought to realize that you have a mission here in your own home, is to see if you can save that soul. And that's his point, is that they had lost perspective, and he had addressed any of their concerns, saying, your marriage, it's still recognized by God. Your children, they're not illegitimate. He addressed all those concerns. And we spent a lot of time going over putting this into the background of ancient Corinth in a very ungodly society, of why these people who had hardly any religious background of value in a very pagan kind of society would have basic questions about what to do in these situations. They are accepting a very different life. So what does it require of me? Does that mean I don't need to be married? If this was wrong, I'll get out. No, it's fine for you to be married. Well, but I'm married to somebody who's not a Christian. Maybe God's not counting. No, it still counts. Children are good. And then he says, but there could be a situation where, but your spouse doesn't like that. Now the question is, what if they're not agreeable? And this is where we come to that phrase, not under bondage. And I mentioned that the nature of the word is not made a slave to. And the whole point is, contextually, that you have a choice to make, and you need to make it for God. You're not under an obligation to cling to that marriage and that spouse, or that spouse requiring you, as a condition of marriage, to leave Christ. And instead, you let them go. Basically, it's an ultimatum kind of situation. Okay, you either leave Christ or I'm out of here. And the answer is, I don't want you to leave, but I'm not leaving Jesus. And that's important because of some of the ways I think people want to come and insert extra reasons as if we get all these extra bonus possibilities to abandon a problem marriage rather than dealing with it. Now, you need to understand that there has been taught a different way to interpret this passage. I think it's important that you know that. That some would say that not under bondage it's the marriage bond, and therefore that marriage bond is broken, and therefore you are free to remarry if this particular thing is the situation. Okay? And the problem with that is they argue, bond, marriage bond. The word bond for the marriage that's used elsewhere is, and I'm just going to ask, listen, you can abandon this information as soon as I say it, but I need you to hear the two together. The one word is deo, and that is what's used of marriage bond. This word is douloo. Both have to do with the idea of a bond, and one comes from the other. But douloo technically is the one related to slavery, and it's what's found here, whereas deo is a more general word and refers to bonds such as what you find with marriage, things that are bound together. It is very important when you find those that when there's a choice that a writer makes, that choice matters to the words he chose. That he didn't choose a general word that's typically used for marriage, which is not under bondage. He used a word that was more specifically of the idea of being a slave. Okay, David? Okay, in English, D-E-O. Deo. I can appreciate why that, technically it's delta epsilon omega, but that's why. Well, I don't know. I don't think it comes from that. That word, when you see it in the English, is going to come from yet a related word that is more of necessary. It is ode, which is related to this. Often when you find it is must or it is necessary in your translations, it's from an idea of a bound obligation. Yes, on debt. Whenever you usually see it as debt. Yes, but it's the general word. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, far be it from me to complain about someone else's tangents. Now, so when we think about this, the key element though is what it would do if we were to say, you accept the premise that what it's intended to do is saying things start over and you become a Christian. And therefore that someone who is as a Christian, once you accept Christ, now you're under that obligation, but everything else is in your past and it's no longer relevant. Okay, so here's the problem. If you take a couple, one is a Christian and one is not a Christian, when the divorce happens, okay, that means that the person who's a Christian is under obligation to stay in the marriage, and the person who is not a Christian can get out of the marriage. Because we've just created two different standards in the situation. And that just is an illustration of why it's a problem to argue that way. Besides it, the main problem is that's not contextually what he's talking about. And we'll illustrate this later as you get further down in the text. Is the whole point is to prioritize your Christianity, and that your Christianity should inform everything that you do, and that includes even the marriage. A marriage, if it were to be the case, it'd be required to, in order for Christianity, would have to be abandoned. Therefore, Acts chapter 5 would be the most important one we'd find. When you get to the idea of, in chapter 5, verse 29, we have to obey God rather than man, it's that principle at play here. And he is simply taking that principle and applying it in this particular situation. Okay? Now, let's continue, because the next section is very, you'd say, almost out of character in this entire chapter, and that has created a number of other problems for people. So I want us to read through it and try to then put it into some context for you. Okay, let's pick it up in verse 17. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. Notice the wording. You are bought at a price, your own slave. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now, the first thing I wanted you to note, I wanted to read the whole section so you could see the connection of the wording that was rooted in the slavery reference, not under bondage, of being Christ's slave, okay, and not being slaves of men. That is the reference directly that you're seeing in from verse 15. He is referring back to it. Now, the first thing you have to do, though, when you come across a passage like this, is remember the overall structure of this text. We've been talking marriage, generally, to the non-married, to the married, but one's not a Christian, to a situation where the unbelieving is not happy about the situation. And then when you look ahead to verse 25, now we're going to go back and he's going to talk to the virgins. So he's still in that context. So the question is, how do these verses fit in that context, and why did he say this? And that has created another argument that people would make, which is to say that they tend to key in on verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. And apply that to marriage. So they would argue that from this, verse 20, again, isolated from its context, but generally speaking, is a context of marriage. Okay, so understand what they're doing. That therefore, anybody, if they obey the gospel, is whatever their situation is marriage-wise, fine, just stay there. Okay? Now that creates some of the same problems as what we saw before, depending upon when you were married. But let me explain another problem for this, as far as this is a very practical illustration of it. Do you know of anybody who's ever chosen to be baptized again later in life? Deciding, well, I didn't really know what I was doing. Do you know someone like that? I have done this on occasion. So. Now, what would prevent somebody, every time they got a divorce and remarried, from deciding that they now understood the gospel and need to be rebaptized? It would make a mockery of the whole thing. Because now we are using baptism as this kind of way of where it ends up justifying what I want. Because I can do that at any time, make my claim, there's no way you can dispute that, and now you accept it. But in actuality, we've actually said no standards are applying. That's a big problem. But the bigger problem is that's not what this is teaching. Okay. Did you notice within this particular section that marriage isn't even mentioned? That's actually the most peculiar part of the whole thing. He's in an entire chapter that's dealing with marriage, but in these verses, that's not what he's talking about. And you need to think through why. And the key is the wording that is tying it back to what he had said in verse 15. And contextually with their situation about their reasoning about it, about wanting to, what changes? What am I supposed to make changes-wise? Well, you think about the two examples that he uses in this text. He uses an example of circumcised, uncircumcised, okay, and slave versus free. Those are the two types of situations he chooses to address. Now, there's a technical thing about the nature of the word that's used as he begins this. He's offering it. It's a really interesting idea. It's not a typical when he says but, it's more except. And he's tying this to what he just said. He's not giving that information. He's offering a qualifier. Okay. If the whole idea is you're not under bondage to stay in that relationship of marriage, okay, so if for Christ, where else might that apply? That's what he's addressing. Because what you have is your big social relationships. He's been addressing marriage, and he said, you're not under obligation to stay in this situation. And he's very specific about the when and the why, and who even initiated it. Very specific. So then next, though, he wants to make sure that they're not going to use that statement as an excuse to get out of other social situations. Primarily, your racial distinction or your social distinction, which would have been the two big things in society at this time. Okay? So let's go through and note that, but I wanted to give you contextually all the reasons why, how it has to fit, and the nature of what he's talking about, so that we're putting it within this context of reference rather than working around it. So we go back to verse 17. But as God has distributed, measured out, to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. Now, walk is a metaphor, right? For living, because that's especially then, right? They walked everywhere, so that was life. Okay, so he's saying that as the Lord has called each one, you have. So there is something here about when you became a Christian that matters, and what. It's also interesting when he says the Lord has distributed each one. It's the situation. Now, the other thing I guess we'll go ahead and get out of the way. You realize the problem that would happen if we apply verse 20 into marriage in a picked it out way? You realize that means if you obey the gospel before you're married, you're stuck, right? Because you were single when you obeyed the gospel. Well, that's not much motivation to obey the gospel early, now is it? Okay? So what we end up doing is not wanting to apply, and that falls within the overall context of this passage, but we don't want to apply it there, so we end up cherry-picking our examples to get what we want. Okay? So we got to be consistent with it. So as he's called, so let him walk. We have responsibilities then to what God has provided, the situations not under our control. And really when he's talking about circumcision, uncircumcision, he's talking about your race, right? Whether a Jew or a Gentile, you're slave or free, that was usually what you're born into. Okay? So you had no control over those things. And he's basically telling you, you ought to be fine with that. Now, that's kind of a hard message, I think, in a 21st century America to hear. But he's saying you need to be accepting of that. But he then says, and so I ordain in all the churches. He does that more than one time. Why does he need to add it there? What's he kind of saying? Because this is his principle of what he's saying is, you stay put, and this is what I tell everybody. I'm not singling you out. So he's telling them actually something that is limiting on them, not freeing for them. Just from the nature of his choice of wording. So now he's going to give his examples. So he gave the principle. This is normal Paul, how he argues. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Now, I think we can understand the second one. Some of y'all maybe never have thought about it much, but now I've got you thinking about the first one. How exactly do we reverse this procedure? There was something that they would do, which was called, technically the language is drawing upon the foreskin in an attempt to imitate what that would have looked like. So that actually was a real thing. They must have wanted it really bad, is all I can say. Why? Well, now you have to go back and again, what is the context of this day? Let's just say that, okay, I'm going to try to be delicate here, but public restrooms were very public restrooms. Okay? So you ain't hiding anything, friends. And that was a tell for who you were. It's not just about persecution as we tend to think of it. We tend to think of persecution in a very 3rd century Rome kind of way. Direct people going over and, the Roman government coming and getting you. It's far more persecution happens within, if you remember when we had this discussion, the social arena than in the structural arena of government. far more, if you think about this, is true in Acts as well. It's happening within society. It is within someone knows and they're just not going to your business. Or they're making things harder on you at your business. Or, if y'all paying attention, there's nothing that's changed in our laws, but that there are people who are Jews that are getting hurt in New York City right now randomly. Okay, just since oddly enough, since they were attacked in Israel. Okay, so why? Because they're Jews. Okay, this was more. They were actually more accepted at this time, I'd say, here. Now, Rome went back and forth on the Jews, usually depending upon what the Jews did in Judea. Okay, but so yeah, it's still, because why? Because it made you stand out as different. For everybody else, there were Gentiles and there were Jews. Gentiles was everybody else. The word Gentiles means nations. That's what the Greek word is. It's Jews and the nations. So Jews were conscious about being different. And sometimes you get tired of being different when it means you lose out on a lot of opportunities. Okay? So that was a reality, and there are all sorts of social reasons of importance, moving within your particular social circle, that it could become a problem. Now, the other side of that, Paul, we see mostly in Galatians, and this is, within the same decade of where there were all the Judaizing teachers, and we know that they would have gone, they were in this area of insisting you needed to be circumcised. So we can understand that because we see so much of the literature in the Bible about that. He says, no. What's his point? Verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. God doesn't care about that. He doesn't care. One time it was a huge deal because it was related to the covenant, right? Instituted by God with Abraham. Okay? It pre-existed as a procedure. That's why Abraham knew what to do. But it represented that covenant, and it was kept through and included in the law, and it was partly what distinguished the Jews. It was one of those big things, along with the temple and the law, that they found their identity in. His point is that may have been true under the old covenant, but circumcision is not going to be what identifies you as being a Christian. Why? Because there are far more important things that identify you as being a Christian, and he's going to say it in the next part. But keeping the commandments of God is what matters. He didn't want them getting all caught up, as the Jews had, in prioritizing certain commands. And remember, if you were circumcised, it was because you had a really good mom and dad Jew that were Jews. Not because you were fantastic, typically, unless you came to it later. Okay, so usually it was because your mom and dad had that done. But it was their identity. Our identity as Christians is in doing what God says. Eddie's lesson 9, the will of God. That is at the core of what makes us who we are. Let me build this out a little bit. Let's eliminate sign outside. Our lives committed to God's will, absolutely, while we're here and individually when we leave here. That's what tells people that we're Christians. Not simply, I hand them this flyer or this pamphlet or something. He's saying, here's your identity. Your identity is doing what God says to do. It is therefore what identifies us as being God's, and it is what binds us together as being His children, and therefore brothers and sisters. He is making sure they understand, don't get caught up in this external way that the Jews did of this is what we had. I mean, if you understand history and you go back to what's going to happen in just a few years, when the temple is destroyed, that pretty much, it really undoes, it just, there's certain aspects of Judaism that are going to collapse. Their records are gone, so they can't have their lineage. Their temple is gone. Circumcision remains the law, yeah, but they really have an identity crisis. Okay? In this case, it was forced. They had just had an identity kind of be like the world that took them into captivity. And but if you look at coming back from captivity with Ezra specifically, in the return of the building of the temple, the renewal of the law, and of getting their lives right enough, and marriage is part of that too. Okay. Doing that was key. He's wanting us to understand where our identity lies. Is in following the gospel and not trying to have and create our own little sect that's a social sect. We are identified spiritually, not socially. And we need to understand that difference. It is in that context that he says, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. So the direct reference is actually to circumcised, uncircumcised. Now, the principle he mentioned was actually just a hair broader because he was making an allusion to the previous section he's about to come back to. Okay? Is this, you don't need to change those things socially about you. Jew and Gentile is equally acceptable to God, and in the same calling as Christianity. Now, he's specifically talking now about what they did socially in this place. Okay, so he's kind of making a word play, because you've got the same calling, which is your social situation, in which you are called, which is your spiritual. So he's making a word play to emphasize the switch of importance and priority. And therefore, he builds upon that in verse 21. Were you called while a slave? Okay, now he's building it out. It applies beyond just, you don't need to worry about your race. Now he's going to build it out and say, were you called while a slave? Now that is low-rung social status, if ever there was one, right? If you are a slave, you have no rights. And this, again, he's ultimately getting back to what he said about not under bondage. Now, first of all, do you realize what this means, though? There were slaves who became Christians. That's the first thing. But now, just put yourself in that frame of mind. Now, slavery for them was not exactly the same as slavery in this country was. But listen carefully what he says. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. Now, I would say that for most Americans, those are fighting words. They were fighting words. But if you can be made free, rather use it. Now, I'm certainly, let's make sure I am not advocating slavery. I want to get that on the table here. I'm wanting us to understand it because he's talking about a social situation, social freedmen. Okay, that's difference in status that he gets to, as you see in verse 22. He's talking about what your primary focus ought to be on. Your primary focus, if you're a slave, should not be on simply getting free. Now, if you're a slave, let me just use a little bit of intuition here and say, that might be my number one priority, is no longer being a slave. If I'm the slave, he's saying it shouldn't be your number one priority. But if you can be made free, rather use it. Now notice what we've got here. It shouldn't be your absolute number one priority, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth, there's some benefit if you could become free. So he's not against getting people free, but he says use it. Notice he has attached a responsibility to freedom from slavery. And he's going to explain that in verse 22. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. Now, this is one of those head scratchers for some people, right? What? His point is, again, what is your situation and if it's about status? Why does this not matter as much as you think? Because if you're a slave, that's what you were, and you're a slave when you obeyed the gospel. You're free. You're free in Christ. But he doesn't say Christ, and that itself ought to alert you to something. That is, since he didn't say free in Christ, you're not Christ's freedman, you're the Lord's freedman. What does that, just that slight choice indicate? You belong to him. That's where he's heading with this. And then he comes down, and likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. For the person that gained freedom, that was a slave, is the Lord's, right, freedman. Why? Because that's authority. And you're free as far as Christ is and in Christ. He is called while free. This is now talking about as free in a social convention, is Christ's slave. And you would think that the wording would be opposite, that he'd be the Lord's slave. But he's Christ's slave. Why? Because that's all the benefits of his messiahship and his kingship rooted in the promises of God. So just the choices he made as to where to place these is fascinating and teaches us something. But here we get down to verse 23, which is the power of it, where he was going with this. You were bought at a price. Now he had just brought, I think this again explains more about, he's put Christ here at the end. Because what was the mission of the Messiah? It was to come and save mankind. To make that possible. That was the mission. He was chosen, that's what the word means, a chosen one. Chosen to come and to die. To provide his blood, which is what it cost to buy us back. That's redemption. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Now, here's the tie-in. You already have a master. You have a master if you're a slave. You're free because I'm a greater master, and I'm making you free spiritually. Not freeing you from that master, but I'm providing all sorts of freedom as the greater Lord. Freedman, you become a Christian, I'm giving you responsibilities. Why? Because I bought you. You're my slave. And so in both situations, the key thing is, which is what's building on what we go back to verse 15, is that we are owned by Christ. We were bought by Christ. And therefore, we don't put ourselves in situations where we think that any man has the right to tell us to get out of Christianity and to leave Christianity and leave Christ. No one. Now we come down to verse 24. Brethren, Okay? He's pulling it all together. We're all family here. Let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. That's the context, but remember what the context is. Don't be using or attempt to use what I've just said about a situation in which the marriage bond, because that person left, that could be abrogated and accepted as an excuse and a means to try to get out of other social responsibilities and situations you're in, to change those. Now, that's talking about race, Jew, Gentile, circumcised, uncircumcised, or slave free, which is social. So racial, social. Now, the time we have left to put this big picture, what is he saying? The Lord's church, Christianity, Christ. Let's start with Christ. Christ did not die on the cross to create a social movement to correct all the ills of society and to overturn society in a revolutionary way. He came to change people spiritually. Now, in doing so, that should have, as we are under obligation to him, huge effects on society. But we need to understand where the priority is. The whole point is you're under obligation, and you are to be known as people who do what I tell you to do, who do my will. This is what identifies you. Not by taking on the cause of freeing slaves in that sense. Not that you don't support that when that possibility is there as a moral thing, you would. He has just explained, though, that Christianity is far bigger and greater than some social justice cause that we sometimes let ourselves get trapped into. And we let our Christianity become politicized, which makes it smaller than what it should be. Hard section, certainly controversial, and I always like to try to show you here are the different ways that people see that so that you're not blindsided by it. But let's also keep it in context. All right, we will pick up there next week.